Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was John Cougar Mellencamp singing Pink Houses. And this week we're not talking about houses, but we are talking about pink. And we're talking about pink in the form of flamingos. And I wanted to profile these guys this week because I've been writing a book about these birds, so I happen to have them on my mind. And also, this is a group that I didn't really know much about before I started researching them for my book. And what I knew about them was not really that interesting. I didn't think that they were that exciting. I hadn't really had much experience with them. And as I was doing all of my research, I found out that actually these are quite unusual and very fascinating birds. And I've discovered that lots of people have many mistaken views about flamingos, or like me, very little information at all. And so the birds tend to be highly misunderstood if they are really thought about ever. And this is despite the fact that they're actually one of the most popular zoo attractions around the world, and that they number in the millions, each species individually, up to several million. And so I wanted to talk about these guys today in order to be informative, and also to raise awareness about them, because actually there are several flamingo species that are of conservation concern. And so it's quite nice to kind of profile these species in need in case some of you guys are inspired by that and would like to go out and maybe donate to some conservation efforts, or go see them in zoos, or support them in some way or another. Now, many people refer to flamingos as pink flamingos, or just flamingos, and they kind of group all these birds together. But as I mentioned already, there are actually several different species. And depending on how you group them together, there are 6 or maybe 5 if you think that 2 of them are subspecies of a single species. And these species are the greater flamingo, the American flamingo, which is also called the Caribbean or the Cuban or the rosy flamingo, the Chilean, which is also called the red-kneed flamingo, the Andean flamingo, the Puna or James flamingo, and the lesser flamingo. And some people actually think that the greater and the American are the 2 subspecies that together form one single species, and there is some argument about that. But I think that it's pretty well established that they're significantly enough different that they can be considered 2 different species. And you'll have noticed that even though there is a rosy flamingo, there is in fact no official pink flamingo. So that's just something that people kind of just say in everyday speech, and it's not really very informative or descriptive. Although, actually, most of the time, if you hear pink flamingos, especially in the U.S., what people are talking about are the plastic variety that are used to decorate the front lawn. Now, the greater flamingo is an Old World species, along with the lesser, and all of the other ones are found in the New World. And a lot of evidence suggests that there was some ancestor, the greater, that went over into the New World and gave rise, after a bit of evolution, to the Caribbean flamingo. And then the Caribbean flamingo was so widely distributed that some of the species to the south in South America also were isolated enough that they could begin to speciate themselves, and that's how you have the 3 species down there, as well as the one in the Caribbean and the ones in the Old World. Now, no matter where they live, the Old World or the New, one thing that all flamingos have in common is this tendency to inhabit very harsh, saline environments that are often quite far away from where we humans live. And that's why actually there's, up until fairly recently in human history, been very little known about these birds, because they are quite difficult to get to. So they live in these saline habitats that are fed either by underground springs that sometimes themselves have salt water in them, or they're fed by springs that come up in salty areas and so therefore have lots of salt that they get from the soil, or they are fed by the sea, and so they have a lot of seawater mixed in this marshy area, and so it's quite saline for that reason. But basically, no matter how it happens that they have this salty environment that they're living in, they do like these places that are quite vast areas of wetland, where they have these pools that form, and sometimes the formation is very sporadic. It happens only when there's rain that collects in a certain basin, or when the tides are high, or when there is an overflow of water from an underground source that springs up. And so they follow the salinity wherever it happens and whenever it happens. And it's quite important because it provides the environment in which their prey items grow. So the flamingos themselves don't really care about the salt, although they are adapted, as I'll talk about in a little while, to deal with the salt. But they're interested in the species that themselves do require that habitat. So these are things like Artemia and diatoms and little invertebrates that live, and they're quite small, and they kind of float around in the water, and the flamingos will eat those. Also quite a lot of cyanobacteria and other phytoplankton types of things. And interestingly, these environments are often, they range really widely. So the guys that live down in South America, they tend to be up at very high elevations, and so it's these very cold, very dry habitats with the exception of the water that they're in, but the air itself is dry. And in Africa, then you've got the other extreme where you've got these birds that are out in very desert-like areas with the exception of these big pools of water. And so these are birds that actually can tolerate a huge range of temperatures. And the water that's there tends to make the ground very mucky and very muddy, and it's quite hard to walk through. And the salt will often crystallize, and so the ground is quite treacherous and pointy and pokey. And so a lot of the people that originally went out to try to find these flamingos and see them in the wild, they were repelled because of the extreme temperatures and the very rough terrain. They often got quite badly injured, and some of them even died in the process of trying to reach the flamingos. And so these habitats are a serious business. And generally speaking, these birds are found in salt pans on the coasts of Africa, in the wetlands in India, so the Rann of Kutch, for example, in the Near and Middle East, wetlands in the Mediterranean, including Spain and France, so some of you might have holidayed in these areas. They're also found throughout the Caribbean, as I mentioned, and also throughout South America in those high plateaus. So they're actually on quite a few continents, and historically they were on every single continent. So there used to be some of these guys that lived on Australia and Antarctica when they were positioned in different places before they broke off and spread apart. And for a long time, people were totally mystified, actually, about where the birds were spending the bulk of their time. And that's because they tend to fly around a whole lot. So as I said, they like these places that have variable temperatures and weather patterns. These habitats may or may not have water at any given time, and so they have to be ready to go at the drop of a hat in order to find the areas that have their food items growing in them. And they seem to have this uncanny sixth sense that tells them when they need to go and where they need to go. And scientists still haven't worked out how it is that they know that they should just take off and fly 500 kilometers away to a new place in order to eat. But they do seem to have this sense. And so humans would think they were going to find flamingos where the flamingos should be, and they'd show up and they wouldn't be there. They'd have taken off and gone somewhere else. So they've been quite a mystery over the decades. And it really took until about the 1950s or so for people to start being able to find them in a systematic way and start keeping long-term records of these birds. Now, flamingos actually have a really good fossil record, one of the best records for birds, as a matter of fact, and actually quite good in the animal kingdom in general. And actually just last week, some of you might have heard that someone reported the discovery of a new flamingo fossil in Spain. And this fossil was a nest that had flamingo-like eggs, but the structure of it was much more similar to a grebe. So I'll talk about flamingo nests and eggs a little bit later, but basically they like to build their nests out of mud, but grebes like to build their nests out of things like twigs and leaves and kind of vegetation. And so this finding that kind of combined flamingos and grebes was quite interesting because there is mounting evidence that suggests that flamingos are the most closely related species to grebes and vice versa. And this has been quite a hotly contested thing over the years because people have suggested that flamingos are related to storks and herons and other similarly tall, long-legged wading birds, which makes a lot of sense if you look at them. But on the other hand, if you look at a grebe, these birds look nothing alike. And so when people first did the DNA work and suggested that actually grebes and flamingos are most closely related, there were quite a lot of people who were very skeptical about this. But there's actually been quite a lot of research since then that shows that it's not just the DNA evidence, but also bone morphology and certain life history characteristics, and even things like parasites. So different species will have different parasites on them based on where they lived and what they come in contact with. And so if you've got two bird species that have very closely related parasites, or even the very same parasite, it's quite good evidence that those bird species are related because the parasites themselves kind of evolve in a similar way to the host species. And so all of this stuff was mounting to suggest that flamingos were quite closely related to grebes, and this new nest evidence suggests the same thing. And all that is quite exciting because both of these birds are very basal in the avian ancestry. So these are very early species that branched off right near the beginning of when reptiles first started transforming into birds. And in fact, flamingos have been in the form that they are currently in for a very long time. And actually they, like sharks, are a living fossil because tens of millions of years ago there was a bird that evolved that looked very similar to the flamingo that we have today, and then it has just not really changed since then. So this really is something that's quite exciting because it's kind of like looking back in time whenever you look at a flamingo. That was Pink Anderson singing "You Don't Know My Mind." Now, before the break, I was talking about flamingos. They're the species of the week. And one of the things that people will say about flamingos, if you ask them about the birds, is that they're really beautiful. But actually, if you look closely at the birds, they're quite strange looking for a number of reasons. They have incredibly long legs that are very spindly. They don't look like they're going to be very strong, like they might snap at any footstep. The bills are quite huge and very clunky and completely outsized for the rest of the bird's body, especially because they have such skinny little necks. And if you look closely at the necks, you can actually see individual vertebrae as they kind of bend and move around. So actually they're very ungainly birds in a lot of ways. And despite this, they do kind of give this overall impression of being quite beautiful because they have that amazing coloration. And they do tend to kind of sit and stand and walk in quite a lovely sort of way that's captivating despite all these odd little characteristics that they have. Now, all the 6 species do have quite a few similarities, but there are also many differences that can help you tell them apart. For example, greater flamingos are quite pale and they're incredibly tall. That's why they have their name. They are in fact the tallest. And although many of them are kind of around the 5-foot mark, there are birds that have gone up to 6 feet or even above that have been measured in the past, and so they actually can stand incredibly tall. Caribbean flamingos tend to be the ones that are most red, so they're not really pink at all. They do kind of surpass that and go to more of a crimsony color, and they might even sometimes go a bit orangey or even purpley depending on the conditions in which they've been feeding, and I'll talk about that a bit in a minute. And Chileans are somewhere in between these two, so they're not quite as pale as the greater, but they're not nearly as pink as the Caribbean either. Lesser flamingos are comparatively quite tiny, and you especially see this when you're out in the wild in Africa, if you are so lucky as to go there, because you can see greaters and lessers standing next to each other, and the lessers basically come up to the breast of the greaters, and so it's really obvious right away which one is which. And they also have very dark bills. They have the darkest bills of all of the different species. So if you see a flamingo that has quite a dark bill with the kind of fading from the nose down into the tip into quite a dark black almost, that's definitely a lesser. And the Andean and the James flamingo both have much more yellow bills, and they're quite fine. They almost look as though they've been painted with a nice kind of black stencil on them. And once you learn about these sorts of differences, then the birds begin to be much easier to tell apart. Although I'm talking here about adults, the juveniles can be quite a bit more difficult because they all have kind of a grayish appearance until they start getting their adult coloration. And it's nice when you start to look at these differences because you'll no longer think of these birds as just pink flamingos, but you'll actually be able to see these differences in the different species. And there are also differences in behavior as well that go along with these morphological things. And so you begin to get much better of an idea of the different personalities of these species. Now, flamingos, as I have already mentioned a couple times, are particularly interesting for certain bits of their anatomy that are quite different from what we see elsewhere in the avian world. So first of all, flamingos, they seem to bend their knees backwards, and actually there are other birds that seem to do this as well. But actually when people say that they have their knees bent backwards, it's actually a misnomer. So what we refer to as their knees are actually their ankles. their true knee it's up much higher. It's up next to their body, and so you can't really see it very well because they're all fluffed up. And so actually the bend that we see is their ankle, and then what they're walking on down at the bottom is their toes. And this is what's called, this is a very hard word to say, so I apologize in advance, digitigrade. And so there are lots of birds that walk around, things like herons, things like secretary birds and other African species that stand on their toes, and their toes look like feet, but actually they aren't. The second thing that really differentiates these guys from other birds is that in two of the species, the Andean and the Puna flamingo, they lack a hind toe, or what's also called a hallux. And this means that they only have 3 toes instead of 4, and this is quite an unusual characteristic as well. Although, of course, if you're going to use that as an identifying characteristic, you'd probably have to be quite close to the birds in the field or have very good binoculars. Now, probably the most obvious thing about flamingos that's quite unique is their coloration. And as I kind of hinted at earlier, the coloration can be quite variable because it depends on the bird's diet. And if you ask people why flamingos are pink, this is something that a lot of children ask as one of their earliest questions about wildlife. It has nothing to do with salmon or shrimp exactly. So a lot of people will say, oh, flamingos eat shrimp, flamingos eat salmon, that's why they're pink. Well, they do get the pink coloration from eating things, but specifically what they're eating is carotenoids. And these are pigments that are made up of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. And they're actually quite simple things. It's just they're chains of all of these different elements. And they are produced by photosynthetic organisms, things like plants and algae and bacteria and fungi. And then other animals eat these things and shuttle all of those pigments into their tissues. And so this is not just flamingos that do this, lots of different species. So robins, for example, that have a nice rosy breast, they will do this. We have lots of species in the U.S. Kind of purple finches and house finches are the classic example in science of how different levels of feeding activity can lead to different shades of reddish coloration in the plumage. And flamingos are getting this particularly from things like cyanobacteria and algae and phytoplankton, things like diatoms. Now, they do eat something called brine shrimp. So these aren't the shrimp that you think of, but they are a little invertebrate crustacean actually in the water, and they're eating these things. They're also called artemia. And these are one of the things. So if you want to have a kind of a loose definition of shrimp, then yes, they do eat shrimp to make themselves pink. Now, there are actually lots of different carotenoids, different types of these reddish pigments, but the most important one for flamingos is cantizanthin. And interestingly, it's not just found in the plumage, which is the most obvious thing, but you see these pigments showing up in egg yolks and in, for example, the liver and in some of the regurgitated food that the parents will feed their chicks. So they're found throughout the body in lots of different tissues at lots of different stages of the bird's lives. And as I mentioned earlier, the young are quite grayish or whitish when they're younger. They don't start producing pink in their feathers until they're about 2 to 4 years old. And all birds, once they shed their pink feathers, the coloration actually fades very rapidly because that pigment bleaches out in the sun. And so you can't really decorate with the flamingo feathers very well because they will rapidly lose their color. Now, flamingos, even when the feathers are on their bodies, they also have to work against the fact that their feathers will deplete in color quite rapidly. And so they kind of use their own europigeal oil or preen oil as a sort of makeup. Now, most birds you'll see them as they're preening, they'll twist around and they'll tuck their noses up under their tails. And what they're doing is rubbing onto that preen gland and getting a sort of oil that comes out. And they have that oil on their beak and they comb it through their feathers. And that helps the feathers stay in the right conditions so that they can fly and so that they can be waterproof, so that they can keep themselves warm. Basically, it keeps the feathers functioning as feathers should function. Well, flamingos have a bunch of cantizanthin that they put into their europigeal oil or preen oil, and so it's quite reddish. And so what they do when they tuck their heads under is that they rub that oil directly on their cheeks and then turn around and rub their cheeks on their shoulders and on their wings and on their necks, whatever they can reach. And this means that they can help replenish their red coloration. And this actually has has been found to make them quite sexy. So they do this more during the breeding season, and the birds that are more red during that time are the ones that get to mate earlier and breed with a partner. And so it's been found then, because of this, that this reddish coloration is something that the birds can do to advertise themselves as being high quality. And if you remember one of my previous shows, I was talking about this. The reason that this shows that they're high quality is that only the birds that have been able to forage sufficiently and get enough carotenoids from the wild are able to then make themselves as red as they need in order to kind of beat out the competition and look more attractive than the others. Now, another quite interesting thing about the flamingos is their bills. So the bill morphology is quite unusual, not just among birds, but actually the entire animal kingdom. And that's because basically they're upside down. So they have a movable top portion rather than bottom portion. And if you think about, for example, I'm talking right now, I'm moving my jaw down. Well, in flamingos, they basically have a stationary lower jaw, and then the top part of the bill, the mandible, that's what they move around. And that's because they spend most of their time when they're feeding upside down, and they have that top portion turned around so that it becomes the bottom portion. So morphologically and functionally, they have an upside down bill. And these bills are bent in the middle, and that helps them maintain a consistency of width all along the gap that's between the two portions of the mandible. And this helps them when they're trying to filter the water through and get the little things that they eat out of the water. Now, some bills are deep-keeled, and these are in the smaller species, so the lesser and the Andean and the Puna. And other bills are shallow-keeled, and these are the larger species, the greater, the American, and the Chilean. And the difference is in the upper mandible size and whether it fits inside the other bill or whether it sits on top of the other bill. And this is not something you may immediately notice if you're just looking at these guys out in the wild, but what's important about it is that it impacts the prey items that the birds can eat. And the different keel size also is associated with the difference in how many lamellae are in their bills and how widely they're spaced. And lamellae are these fine little fingers, if you like, that stick up, and they help filter out all these food particles that are washed over them and trapped in them as the birds filter the water through. And another thing that's called lamellae, to kind of help you visualize this, is the underside of a mushroom. So if you think about a mushroom cap, the one that you might cook with for dinner, it has all those little striations underneath it. So you can just think they're like little ridges that things can catch in. It's the same idea that applies with flamingos, only the lamellae are vertical. They stick up more rather than being kind of side to side. So the size and spacing of these alters what you can get out of the water. So if you've got really big ones and they're really widely spaced, you're only going to hold on to big items of food. If they're smaller and they're closer spaced, you're going to get lots of small little things. And so you can see how this would affect what prey items the birds are going to target. Now, as I mentioned earlier when I was describing flamingos, the bills are quite huge relative to their little skinny necks. And you would look at a flamingo and think, how could it possibly heft this thing around, especially on land and then in water? Well, the thing is that it's actually quite porous, all of the bills, and so they're very light. And actually, not only are they light when the birds are walking around on land, but they're so light that they'll float on the water. So as the birds are feeding, they can just kind of rest their heads like little boats on the top of the water, and then just kind of push under a little bit in order to filter the water through at an appropriate depth. And one really fascinating thing about the birds' mouths and bills is that they actually have tissue in the bottom of their mouths that functions in the same way as erectile tissue in humans. And this is a great discovery that was actually made by someone in my hometown, so I always have to feel kind of proud about this. But what they did was they took these flamingo carcasses and put dye into all of the veins, and then they imaged the dye. And what they found was that there's this hugely vascularized area in the bottom of the mouth, and it had lots and lots of veins. And basically the birds just always have tons of fluid running through the veins, and so that keeps it quite tight and quite sturdy. And they think that the reason that they have this erectile tissue is that it helps them improve their feeding efficiency by giving them a bit more sturdiness. Because they're upside down, it's kind of hard to grip things and suck the food from the lamellae up into the neck and the throat in order to swallow. And so this tissue helps them accomplish all of that at a very awkward position. And actually, as I said before, this is all quite unique. So flamingos are the only birds that feed in this strange position, and actually there are only a few other animals in the whole animal kingdom that also have this kind of inverted lifestyle. So it's quite an interesting thing that not only have they switched themselves to be upside down, but they also have developed specific things that allow them to feed like this and to live like this. Another quite interesting thing about flamingos is that they have salt glands just above their eye sockets, and these are located internally. And you probably are not surprised to hear this, since I've emphasized how very saline their environments are. So here they are filtering all this food all the time, and in the process they're bound to be exposed to quite a lot of salt that they do take in, as well as just wash back out. And they have to be able to excrete that because, as you already know, salt can be quite toxic if you have high levels of it. And so they have, like other seabirds, they have these glands that help them store up all the salt and then excrete them out their nostrils so that they don't get overloaded and it doesn't become toxic. And one last kind of fascinating thing about flamingo morphology is that the birds have pretty terrible vision, to be honest. They have quite a narrow and long field of vision, and it's to the front of them, but because, to the front of their eyes if they're facing over their bill, but because they turn themselves upside down when they're feeding, that means that basically they're staring at the bottom of their bill as they walk ahead and feed. They aren't able to see out to either side or back behind them or in front of them, so they don't really have any idea what they're walking into as they feed, because they always feed walking forward, and yet they can't see in that direction. And so if you look at them for a long time, you'll notice that they're frequently moving their heads as they feed. And researchers think that they're doing this because they have to occasionally change the viewpoint and make sure that there's not something out there that's trying to hunt them. And one of the reasons that they may have this really acute vision down towards the tip of their bill, which is much more common in animals that have to peck at food items in order to grab them, but flamingos don't. So researchers think that the reason that they see so well there is that it helps them coordinate their chick feeding behavior, because they have this little hook at the end of their bills, and they have to position that hook perfectly in their chicks' mouths in order to give them that regurgitated food I talked about earlier. And so by having really good vision in that area, they're able to maybe coordinate this exchange much better. And one thing that I've read several times but have never been able to get a researcher to confirm for me is that reportedly flamingos have bigger eyeballs than their brains. And I'm not sure, to be honest, whether that has more to say about the size of their eyeballs or the size of their brains.